I think this is such a special panel, I think we should give ourselves as much time as possible to learn from these gentlemen. I'm Tom Steyer, I'm the moderator, and we're here as a group to discuss the West as a source of innovation and growth. And if there's one topic where the West is booming, it's energy throughout the region. There is talk of North American energy independence. There has been incredible technological innovation over the last decade. The size of the reserve bases and production has grown rapidly and is expected to grow much more. It's also a time when people around the world are especially focused on responsible energy development and global climate change. So we are really, really lucky today to have three people up here with incredible backgrounds, incredible knowledge, and incredible insights into energy in North America. So let me just go in order. I think you probably all know Steve Chu, who's here at Stanford, who's the former Secretary of Energy, who has won some famous prizes, who is as knowledgeable on energy as anybody in the United States. Sitting to his left is Jim Prentice, who's the Senior Executive Vice President and Vice Chair of CIBC, which is, for those of you who don't know what those initials stand for, a huge bank. He's a former member of the House of Commons. He chaired the Operations Committee of the Cabinet. He's a Minister of Industry, Minister of the Environment, and Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development. He knows as much about what's going on north of Montana as anyone, so it is really great to have him here. And to his left is Adrian Lajous, who is currently the president of Petrometrica, which is an energy consulting company in Mexico. He's a director of Schlumberger. He's the senior energy advisor of McKinsey & Company in Houston. He's the president, this goes on, of the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies in the UK. He's a senior energy advisor to Morgan Stanley, and he's the former CEO of Pemex and special advisor to the president of Mexico. So we are going to hear each one of these panelists talk on topics that they're particularly interested in. Then we're going to have a few questions from me. Then we're going to open it up to questions from everybody. I truly think that we all have an enormous amount to learn from these three people. So I'd say we get started with Secretary Chu.
Well, first, Tom, I'm no longer Secretary Chu. I'm Steve Chu. And we decided to start with a simple professor and work our way up. But in terms of energy, both energy in the west of North America, but a little more widely energy in North America, I think Tom said a lot of things that really made sense. The technology for energy is rapidly improved, and the landscape for energy in the last decade has rapidly improved or changed. And by that, one might in this room think immediately of fossil fuel, but I would say it's fossil fuel, it's renewable energy, it's potential for transmission distribution that we can rethink how we do that, and don't forget energy efficiency. That's still a very big deal. Let me just, again, I'm going to try to keep my remarks to a few minutes. In terms of energy, we have tremendous fossil fuel resources in the world, let alone North America. And many people have, I think over the last 5 or 10 years, think, energy problem over. No, energy problem not over. We have an energy climate problem. And certainly in the next 20, 30 years, we're going to have to start to capture the carbon from our point sources, not only coal, but natural gas, cement, steel. We have to start doing this, otherwise the tip of the anti-iceberg, which we've been seeing in the last 30, 40 years in weather events, will get worse. So to remind you of a saying of a former Saudi oil minister, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. And the oil age is not going to end because we run out of oil. we have the technology to find, extract oil, natural gas liquids, I think that will get us for at least the next half century, probably this century. But we need to use these resources wisely as we wean ourselves away from that. So let's talk about oil and natural gas. It is certainly the discoveries of natural gas, hydraulic fracturing. Those things are very much in the front level. The United States has increased its oil and natural gas liquids production since 2004, 2005 by 3 million barrels a day. It's dubious as to whether we're number 2 or number 3 in oil production. We've probably just passed Russia for sure in oil and natural gas production, or somewhere near there. Whether we overtake Saudi Arabia, we don't know. It will not be for a long period of time, but just to give you the scale of what's been happening. Our peak oil production in the 70s was about 9.5 million barrels a day. We're going north of 7. We used to be at well below that. This is astounding. The natural gas also astounding. The Henry Hub price is about $3.50. In Europe, it's about $15. In Japan, it's maybe $18. And so there's a huge dynamic going on here where it wrapped up in a lot of things as to how we use this energy in North America and how much gets exported. But let me go back to renewable energy. We also are blessed with tremendous renewable energy in North America, and we shouldn't forget that. Canada has tremendous hydro resources. The Pacific Northwest the United States has hydro resources. Mexico has hydro resources. Hydro resources mean that's actually a good counterplay to renewable energy as well. How do we develop those and use them across our borders effectively, I think is a point of discussion we should think about. And I know both when I was at the Department of Energy, both Canada and Mexico, lots of discussions on how we can help each other, transmission, distribution, energy efficiency, things of that nature. So I'm just laying this all out on the table that if we can take advantage of these resources and use them wisely, if we can take advantage of our natural geography, we should do this. It's beneficial to all 3 countries, beneficial, and ultimately I'll go back to what I care about a lot, and that is climate change and the energy associated with that.
Okay. Jim?
Well, thank you very much, Tom. And let me just say at the outset what a pleasure it is to be on stage with former Secretary Chu. We had a wonderful relationship when we were counterparts in the Canadian and U.S. government. So this is the first time we've been on a stage together. So I look forward to it very much. At the beginning of the last session, Moderator Kennedy invited us as either Canadians or Mexicans to comment upon whether it was better to be periodically abused or chronically ignored by our larger neighbor. And it brought to mind something I heard Minister Guardado say in Mexico just last week when he drew upon the famous metaphor of the mouse and the elephant and pointed out that if you are the mouse in bed with the elephant, if the elephant becomes agitated, it's concerning. But if the elephant becomes amorous, it's dangerous. So I have been speaking for some time about the implications of North American energy security. Some use the term independence, I don't. And the geopolitical consequences of that, and in particular about the North American competitiveness and the triple advantage that I believe opens up for us as North Americans today. And certainly a security advantage, secondly, an industrial advantage, and thirdly, an environmental advantage. And to be sure, as Secretary Chu says, these are volatile times. If you are a producer, a consumer, if you're concerned about the environment or specifically concerned about climate change, these are very consequential and volatile times. Because what we've seen in North America is that step changes in technology applied to known geographic and geological conditions have resulted in just extraordinary step changes in terms of North American supply of energy. That's true in the oil sands. It's true in the heavy oils across the continent. It's also had incredible ramifications in terms of directional drilling, fracking, and many of those issues which you will hear about. All of this has led to just extraordinary increases in North American supply. And the consequences of all this have unfolded really with breathtaking speed. It's advanced from the theoretical to commercial innovation to what is now starting to bite with real market consequences at a rapidity with which it's very difficult actually to keep up. All of this, I think, would make one a disciple of the advantages of free markets and the advantages of technology. And to be sure in all of that, there are clear winners and losers, and it's very difficult to see how North America is not the clearest winner of all. In the last 5 years, we've seen remarkable changes where the United States, for example, has moved from a deficit position in terms of the production of hydrocarbons to a position where I think President Obama indicated just today in a speech in Ohio that for the first time the United States is now producing more oil domestically than it is importing for the very first time. And actually for the first time as well, the United States, through amelioration of consumption by consumers and other factors, is using less oil this month than last month. But, and looked at in a slightly broader term, if you take oil production, NGL production, renewable fuel production, all liquid fuels together, the United States is today the #1 producer of liquid fuels in the world. And as Stephen Chu points out, soon to be the largest producer of hydrocarbons, simpliciter. And so that's all unfolded in the last 5 years, remarkable changes. LNG plants that were built to import are now available for export. Incredible changes right across the board in terms of oil production, natural gas production, and the consequences of all of this. African oil, for example, no longer comes into the North American continent over the course of the last several months. It's been pushed off elsewhere. Countries like Venezuela are scrambling now to develop markets in India and Asia because their oil is no longer able to access the North American market in the same way. The United States has moved from a country that imports something in the neighborhood of 1.5 million barrels per day of refined petroleum products, gasoline, diesel, to a country that exports a similar number. All of that taking place in 3 years. So these are remarkable developments, even from the short time when Secretary Chu and I were at Copenhagen. They have profound implications. They have profound implications in a geopolitical sense for each of our countries, for the United States for sure. They're beyond, I think, our discussion points today. They have profound market implications for Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And maybe for the first time in our recent history, our interests are no longer necessarily always aligned. We may, in fact, be competitors, for example, in the export of LNG. And to return to the question that was similarly asked by Governor Carstens at lunch, the question which I'll focus my comments on is, from a macro sense, what should we be doing as North Americans, and especially as Western North Americans, to take advantage of this triple advantage that we have: an energy advantage, a security advantage, an environmental and an industrial advantage. And this is, because of the geographical location of the resources, very much a Western North American story. I think everyone in the room is generally familiar with Canada's circumstance. We are a trading nation. There is no country amongst the G7 that is more dependent on trade than Canada. 2/3 of our economy is linked to trade. Most of that with the United States. Energy is a big part of that dynamic. The largest exporter of oil, hydrocarbons, into the United States is not Saudi Arabia, it's not Venezuela, it's Canada by a wide margin. Canada supplies about 20% of all U.S. imports of oil. Canada also obviously supplies all of the hydroelectricity which is produced in North America and consumed in the United States as imports. and is also obviously the largest exporter of natural gas into the United States as well. All of this has happened, and the point of reciting these statistics, all of this has happened really within the bosom of NAFTA, which we have just heard, I think, an exceptional panel speak about. These energy flows which I speak of are representative of what has become the world's largest and most successful free market for energy. And on both sides of the border, we have benefited enormously from NAFTA and from the energy marketplace which it has opened up for all of us. There's nothing like it actually functioning anywhere in the world today. And so to return to the question that Governor Karsten's put before us, which is how do we specifically take advantage of the opportunities that all of this presents, let me just address the whole question of North American competitiveness and Western North America competitiveness, and address that question in the context of the macro, environmental, and energy situation that our two countries faces. And let me speak firstly to what we are doing currently, as opposed to what I think we should be doing. And I will return to that second point. In terms of what we are doing right now, from my perspective, and I'm speaking about the Keystone XL pipeline debate, I think that we have found ourselves in a circumstance between our two countries where that has become the debate rather than the broader issue of what we should be doing amongst ourselves to take advantage of this triple opportunity that has opened up for us as North Americans in terms of our competitiveness. Let me be clear, I am of the view that I hope President Obama approves this project. I think it is one that's in the best interest of Canada, it's in the best interest of the United States. I think that the Canadian oil which it would export into the United States reflects environmental standards that are just as high, if not higher, than anything that pertains in the United States. And to be sure, they are much more exacting and much more stringent than applies to the oil which is imported into the United States from other countries such as Saudi Arabia or Venezuela. And I would also say that this project is one that is consistent with NAFTA, and it's also consistent, I think, with the climate change positions which have been advocated by both Canada and the United States internationally. What do I mean by that? If you were to look at the most recent statements made by the American climate change negotiator, Mr. Todd Stern, who I respect enormously, what the United States and Canada are both calling for is a flexible international regime, one that allows countries to determine their own commitments and to approach those commitments in a manner which is consistent with their own circumstances. In climate change parlance, this is known as sort of common but differentiated responsibilities. And so I simply leave with you today the question that if the United States advocates those principles to apply internationally to all countries, why would the same principles not apply to a country that is the best neighbor and friend of the United States in terms of a 25-year relationship within the framework of NAFTA? Why would those same principles not apply? But the real point, as I draw to a close, is simply this. The Keystone XL debate has really taken over the discussion. It has taken the remainder of the oxygen out of the room, if you will, when really what we should be talking about is the harmonization of our environmental, our regulatory policies on a continental basis to really take advantage of the joint resource blessings that we have and to ensure that the security advantage, the environmental advantage, and the industrial advantage accrues to all of us as North Americans. I think parts of that discussion are more obvious than others, but I would simply make the point that when we speak about the environment, that Canada and the United States have a remarkable history of working together on environment to join common cause, everything from the Migratory Birds Convention a century ago to the work that's been done on the Great Lakes, to the Clean Energy Dialogue that former Secretary Chu and I presided over, to the Acid Rain Treaty, which is one of the most successful cross-border initiatives in the world to reduce acid rain. We have a long history of working together to deal with environmental issues. And so if there are issues that we need to discuss, we should do that. We should discuss it within the context of NAFTA and the long-standing relationship that we've had. We should address those issues, and we should come up with North American solutions. And at the end of the day, how those are applied contextually in Canada may not be identical to how they are applied in the United States. From time to time, they will be. For example, when I was Canada's Environment Minister, we were able to arrive at joint fuel emission standards, which have actually been the most successful thing post-Copenhagen in terms of the reduction of carbon emissions. Joint standards developed by Canada and the United States that apply to passenger vehicles. We did that jointly, and there's no reason why jointly we can't arrive at similar standards for the balance of the transportation grid. There are other areas, for example, coal thermal plants, where Canada has moved more quickly than the United States and has a policy in place to phase out all thermal electric coal plants in Canada as they reach the end of their useful life. And the United States is moving through the EPA today on a similar policy, but is not quite as far along, again, because their circumstances are different. And so we need to work together. We will have different circumstances, but we can accomplish the most if we do it in concert. And so I would simply say that the real issue before us isn't a single pipeline. The real issue before us is the continued build-out between Canada, the United States, with the addition of Mexico, of the world's most successful energy systems, taking advantage of the natural resource blessings that we have, bringing on cleaner sources of energy such as hydro, and ensuring that we do this to our collective advantage as North Americans. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Adrian.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You know, it's a real pleasure to be here with you today, and a great honor for me to be on the same panel with Professor Chu. My admiration for him is enormous, and I really feel very honored to be on the same panel. And his presence has pressured me a bit to maybe at some point talk about longer-term issues regarding energy in Mexico and more generally, but because I was really thinking of concentrating, and that's what I'll do, on short and midterm energy issues, and specifically in the hydrocarbon area. You know, I've become with age more and more skeptical about our capacity to imagine the future, and I'm saying this in Palo Alto, to imagine the future and to foresee the future, and obviously act on the future. But notwithstanding that, I am well aware of the importance that the effort to do that implies. But let me start with the more pedestrian sort of issues, and basically that, you know, U.S. crude oil from Mexico has been losing markets in the U.S. Gulf Coast as a result of an interaction of supply, domestic supply and demand issues in both countries. So it's really the result of what's happening inside the two countries that is really, I think, changing things dramatically. Mexican production has stagnated and is falling gradually at a relatively slow rate. Domestic requirements have been increasing in Mexico, particularly for light crudes, which is what is, you know, the big increments in this country have been precisely in the area of light crudes. U.S. production of these crudes is absolutely soaring at the time that U.S. demand for oil and oil products are falling. The aggregate and compounding effect of these trends is a very strong displacement of Mexican crude oil exports that are having to flow to Asia. I mean, the whole direction of trade is changing very dramatically, and to the surprise of many of us, we're moving away from North America in terms of our crude oil exports and gradually moving to Asian markets. To give you an example, I mean, only in the last 9 months, of this year, crude oil exports to the U.S. Fell 14% with respect to the same period last year. So it is an important change that is taking place. As the U.S. cannot export crude oil, it has increased its exports of oil products, turning this country, as was stated by the president today, into really a growing net exporter of oil products. And Mexico, on its own, its supply has also been constrained in the products area, and we are importing pretty massive amounts of gasoline and diesel from the U.S., and this increase is speeding up. Today, Mexico is importing almost half of the gasoline that it uses in the country, mostly from the U.S., and about a third of all of the diesel consumption in Mexico really comes mostly from U.S. refineries. The same trends are appearing in the gas markets. Mexico is importing today about 2.5 BCF, a billion cubic feet per day of natural gas. It's a growing number, and practically all of this comes from the U.S. We're phasing out LNG imports into Mexico, and will, I suspect, eventually, or no, not eventually, in a relatively short time, totally eliminate LNG imports and have all of our imports come to Mexico by pipeline into the country from the U.S. From the U.S. directly, and specifically from South and West Texas, but indirectly from other basins in the U.S., and also indirectly from Canada. Now, just to give you an idea of the dimensions, what we are currently importing, the volume of gas that we are currently importing is about the size of the liquefaction plants, the first stage liquefaction plants that are being built in Sabine Pass on the U.S. Gulf Coast. So, it's not an insignificant amount by any means, and I suspect that you will see this volume growing very fast, and I could imagine very easily that this would more than double from now to 2018, both because of pent-up demand that has not been adequately catered for, but also because of the expansion basically in power generation, demand in the power generation sector, and of course in industry. Now, I'll mention now, but I'll come back to it. We are moving very rapidly and very aggressively to use natural gas more intensely. And I would like to maybe talk a bit later on about the sort of environmental and global warming effects that this policy might have. But let me, for the time being, continue on the shorter term issues. Because given Mexico's production decline and constrained supplies of natural gas and oil products, most of this rearrangement most of the rearrangement of U.S. hydrocarbon flows have become, in fact, a short-term blessing for Mexico. We are importing very inexpensive gas and oil products from our next-door neighbor and main trading partner at prices that, without any doubt, are the lowest in the world today. And this is extending to Mexico, something which I think is absolutely essential, which is the improvement in the competitive position, more generally, of North American manufacturing, production, and exports, particularly those that are energy intensive. But this is happening in Mexico, and I think it will have an even greater impact in the midterm future. Now, the short-term and midterm benefits as we all know, might also entail significant longer-term costs. Growing excess refinery capacity in the U.S. Gulf Coast eliminates economically the possibility of refinery expansion in Mexico, as the value of the refineries is a fraction today of their replacement cost. So a new complex greenfield refinery in Mexico costs today up to 4 times what you might, its capacity costs about 4 times more than what, capacity that you might acquire in the U.S. So, this really eliminates any real investment in new refineries in Mexico. But also, competing very low price U.S. natural gas is already exercising, but it will exercise even more pressure on eventual non-conventional gas production in northern Mexico. I mean, we're really going to have to make an enormous effort to remain competitive in terms of developing our own non-conventional resources in northern Mexico. And clearly, all of this is going to reduce our self-reliance in terms of hydrocarbons, in spite of the fact that we are exporters, and up till now, significant exporters of crude oil. But the commercial challenge that we're facing in terms of moving crude oil to Asia is not a small one. And the reason being that to be able to export the heavy crude that Mexico produces and that Canada produces, we are going to have to send that crude to an area where the deep conversion capacity in refineries is limited, and we don't know if it will grow at a pace that can really absorb the crude oil, both from Mexico and from Venezuela, that will be displaced out of this area. Now, as you can imagine, I started my career in the oil industry about 35 years ago. At that time, I was peddling crude oil all over the world, all of the Mexican crude oil that was exported. And I never imagined, couldn't possibly imagine the type of integration pattern, a very beneficial one, that is taking place today, the specific form that this pattern has taken. So there again, also caution, one has to be very respectful about our own capabilities of looking at the future. Now, you might ask yourselves, what will Mexican energy reform affect these trends? Will it in any way? And here again, I'm sorry to be very myopic. It gives a very sort of a more pessimist view than what I would like to convey. But if you simply look at the short and medium term, I suspect that energy reform in Mexico will have relatively little effect on the Mexican energy balance, let's say in the midterm, and to make it short, during the current government administration. So it really requires a real statesman-like attitude by the Mexican president today to say, I'm going to do the things that need to be done, and it's going to cost me very dearly in terms of political capital, but I have to do it now in spite of the fact that I will probably not benefit during my term in office from all of this. I think a bit like this happened when Jaime Serra was describing NAFTA. This clearly happened at that point of time. President Salinas was a far-sighted man that was really looking at the longer term and not in a myopic way like myself, just in the short and medium term. Now, the Mexican president has sent a constitutional reform bill to the Senate. In fact, he sent it last August. And this bill, really the only thing that it does, which is very important, is takes away constraints. Really fundamental constraints in terms of private investment in the industry, both domestic and international, and the introduction of competition in the energy sector. I mean, this is really major change, but it's only the beginning. The only thing that his reform bill has up till now is elimination of restrictions. We have not even begun to think out what the implications is and what a real short, mid, and longer term energy reform program will look like. I'm sure the government has their views, but they have up till now really kept them very much to themselves. Notwithstanding this, I think the process is going to be relatively long in terms of discussing the more constructive part of the reform once these restrictions are eliminated. And that will, imply a lot of work and enormous challenges. And there will be lots of discussion, and if you later on want to know a bit more or have a taste for the current discussion that is taking place and a bit more texture to it, I will very happily go into it. Up till now, there's very little that has been, actually put forward by the Mexican government. So we have to sort of work on a lot of conjectures and a lot of assumptions. I believe personally that this bill, which is the first step, will be passed shortly. It will be passed certainly within this year. And it is a first step that has to be made. The government has to resolve very complex strategic dilemmas. The only thing that I would like to stress tonight is that actual reform of the Mexican energy sector will take a lot of time. And it will take a lot of time. It will not be blessed the way that NAFTA was, in which immediately we had positive effects and impacts. This is going to take longer because, mind you, what we're really attempting to do is to change, is to modify in a very deep way the current structure and replace it with a new one. We want to move in an orderly way from what has been a state monopoly that is more than 70 years old to a situation in which we will have a much more private investment and in a situation in which there will be more competition. A change of regime in this respect is an ambitious part of this reform, a central part of this reform, and I would insist that it is something that takes time. These structures are very deep. There's a lot of inertia associated to them, and to actually make the changeover will take more time. I think it'll take much more time than what the government believes today. Personally, I think they are sort of overestimating the type of impacts that you will have in the short and medium term. But the only thing that I am sure is that the government now has to go ahead and carry out this process. Otherwise, it would be really doomed. I was at a meeting this weekend in Mexico City, and I mentioned there that up to very recently, we used to believe that the mother of all reforms was the fiscal reform that was before the government. Now we're all talking about energy as being the mother of all reforms. I think we should be much more realistic and think of this in terms of a reform that will do no harm, which is not always easy, and a reform that will really improve the competitiveness of the Mexican economy and specifically of the Mexican manufacturing sector. That's what we really have to do. And of course, we have to give better options to the final consumer. Now, let me just make one longer-term remark regarding gas and what the role of gas is going to be in Mexico in this transition from one energy system to another. I am convinced that gas will play a bridge role, an important bridge role, in the process of decarbonizing the Mexican economy. Clearly, as we move into natural gas, and we do that aggressively, it has a short-term benefit of reducing greenhouse emissions. But it is not a long-term solution. Eventually, we will have to bite the bullet and really either capture those emissions or alternatively really develop much more rapidly both the non-hydrocarbon sources of energy and also become clearly much more efficient than we are today. The energy intensity of Mexico is a very high one, and it's a very high one because it is a vice that is present in practically all the large oil-producing countries. We have to lower that energy intensity. But the problem of the bridge is that we don't really know, in terms of time, it's a time bridge, how long do we really have to really make the basic move of, for example, capturing those emissions. We all know what the technical solution is, but we're not yet clear how it will evolve effectively and in what time frame in terms of being an industrial reality. So just these few comments simply to elicit maybe some questions from all of you.
Okay. Can I ask a question, Steve? Let me start with Steve Chu, which is this. We've been hearing a lot about the technological advances in hydrocarbons, and you specifically quoted the drop in the price of natural gas, which is so dramatic. Mm-hmm. We also know that the amount, people were talking about peak oil, and I think I haven't heard that phrase for about 5 years, and I don't think anyone's talking about peak oil anymore. So my question is, in a time when all of the asset sizes and are going up and the costs are going down, where does that leave renewables? And are we going to go through another cycle where we're very excited about renewables when the cost of fossil fuels is high, and then when the cost of fossil fuels comes down, they're a lot less attractive on the market?
Okay, so again, if you're asking me to predict the price of oil worldwide, there are many people in the room who are better qualified than me, and many people have always made predictions, and including the EIA and the IEA, and I would say their track record is about equivalent to random. But I do think there are two pressures. There's a downward pressure because consumption in the OECD countries has declined. The consumption in the United States in oil has declined. I said before we had a $3 million barrel a day increase in production. We're importing 6.5 million barrels a day less. Okay, so the overall consumption is going down, which is a good thing. So there's downward pressures like that, and there's a temporary, I would say there's a temporary surplus. By temporary, the year, 2 years, there's a surplus. The only reason oil prices candidly are as high as it is because of concern in the Middle East, which is a future concern. But the price is dictated by concerns and instabilities. There's another factor that could keep prices up. I would be shocked if it goes to, for extended period of time, below $60 a barrel, simply because many nation states with national oil companies can't actually survive with such a low, that they've become addicted to the national revenues of the countries at if it goes to $40, $50 a barrel, there's a whole bunch of countries whose economies will be in dire trouble. And so the one might have to do what it takes, and already Saudi Arabia is they can afford it because their lifting costs are very inexpensive, but they're going to want to cut back. But there are other countries who just simply have to, they've got addicted to the income, the free money, if you will. And so I think they will do what it takes in order to not see it, unlike in the 70s and early 80s, where, yeah, you can make it go back down to $20 a barrel and crush competition. There's a different effect here now. Saudi Arabia can't let it go down to $20 a barrel for their own national purposes, as many of the exporting countries. So I think, that's one thing. Renewables, the renewable technology is still getting better and better. Is it getting better faster than fossil fuel recovery? I don't know, but I think it probably will in the end. But there's this, the 8,000-pound gorilla in the room, carbon emissions, which is still there. And so that's something one can't just say, oh, well, problem solved or problem postponed for 30 years. As you well know, the longer we postpone it, the more dire we get. Can I make a
Please.
Okay. While I was listening, I don't know if all of you people in the audience are true oil experts, and as we're listening to your remarks, I would just want to, as the professor in me wants to clarify a few things so you may all know this. Oil is not all oil. There's sweet oil, there's sour oil. Sweet, sour, lots of sulfur. There's very heavy oils. The tar sands oil, very heavy oil. Venezuela oil, very heavy oil. Mexico has very heavy oil. The reference to refineries is subtle because refineries are built for handling either sour or crude, heavy oils or not. The flexibility of many refineries around the world it may be challenged. In the United States, just a remark, for a while the oil companies were thinking these are albatrosses around their neck. And they were unloading refineries. And all of a sudden, when there's incentive, they're thinking these are going to be money-producing machines. What's different? What's different is if you have advanced technology and you can update your refinery, you can take hydrogen from natural gas, reformed, and you can mix the hydrogen in to create the high-value products, airplane fuel, diesel fuel, gasoline. And so those heavy oils then become a producer. Otherwise, you just fractionally distill and you get bunker oil, you get fuel oil, you get the low-value stuff. So when all of a sudden, because actually of natural gas and the ability to make hydrogen, the oil refineries in the United States say, hey, we've got it good now. We can, and when the United States actually sees this opportunity, their ability to move technology forward and to develop technology is better bar none. And I think your reference was, will other countries be able to move that fast to convert their refineries to handle the sour, the thick oils? And it will take much more time. And so I just wanted to explain, because if you're not into the oil business, that's what you were talking about. I have lots of other comments, but I'll just limit to one question. And what you said, it's a question / a comment. What you said about Pemex as a state-owned monopoly, and can that company change its culture to interface with the multinationals, to work with the multinationals, which are used to working in a much quicker, more nimble way than a state-owned monopoly, and that will be the real issue. I worked for AT&T Bell Laboratories for 9 years, and even though Bell Laboratories was the greatest thing I've ever seen in my life in terms of research and things of that nature, I also could see AT&T as a monopoly and the incredible business decisions they were making decade after decade, which broke my heart. Okay? And because they were a monopoly for half a century or more. And that change in culture is going to be a real issue. So I was listening to you, I said, boy, you got it right. It is not trivial when you're a state-owned monopoly for 50, 70 years to get into a different mode and work in the best way possible with the multinationals.
Jim, can I ask you a question?
Sure, I'd like to come back to the step change in technology. If
Okay.
I might just add a comment following on.
Why don't you go ahead?
On Stevens. Well, if you're concerned about carbon emissions, and we should all be concerned about carbon emissions because of climate change, then coal is very much part of the equation. And what our natural resource endowment now allows us to do as North Americans is to use natural gas as a bridging fuel. We all want to see the technological changes in renewables bring the price down. But in the intervening time, we can use natural gas as a bridging fuel to reduce carbon emissions. And one statistic that struck with me from my time as environment minister is that 40% of the carbon that's in the atmosphere today came from burning coal. That's really the thing that we should be the most concerned about. And it's the easiest to rectify. And in fact, the market is rectifying it right now as we sit here. And so that's one of the technological and resource advantages that's opening up to us as North Americans, because natural gas here is $3, $4 a foot. And the price in China is $12 to $16. So,
Well, that's exact. Let me go further on that, because you've talked about us basically as a hemisphere working together on economic and environmental
Right.
bases. So when you look out 30 or 40 years, to ask Adrian's point, what is the framework that you think about so that we can both produce economic success for all of us,
Right.
and also do it in an environmental way so that we know at the end of that time we will have progressed enough so that we won't be in a bad situation from a climate standpoint or an environmental standpoint? What's the framework that you think about?
well, that's an excellent question. The framework to me is defined by NAFTA and the trading relationships that we have that allow the free market to flourish within a structure that is put in place collectively. So as I look further down the road, we would have harmonized standards where that's possible. We would, for example, have a transportation system that is harmonized across the board. We've done passenger vehicles, but we can also do heavy vehicles. We can do the rail system. We can do aviation in a harmonized North American way to the highest possible efficiency standards. We can also take advantage of the natural resource endowment we have. I've spoken of natural gas. There's also hydro. Stephen and I've talked about this in the past, but it makes no sense for us to be burning coal in some states in the United States when we could be bringing on massive hydro projects in Canada that could essentially green very much of the North American electricity system, and perhaps Mexico as well. I'm not as clear on that, but certainly Canada has the capacity to bring on up to 20,000 megawatts of clean hydroelectricity energy, reduce coal emissions. That's something that we should be focused on. And so it's a question of harmonizing our standards where we can, recognizing that there will be differences because our industrial bases are different, but also taking advantage of the resource endowments that we have. And I think what that produces at the end of 30 years, which is a good time frame to look at, is a competitive advantage for us as North Americans that no one else in the world has. I mean, we will be energy secure. We will have the lowest cost hydrocarbons for industries that need it, and we'll have an environmental advantage that will open up incredible benefits. I was in Beijing last week. You couldn't see across the street from basically emissions from coal burning plants. So.
Adrian, let me follow up a little on what Steve was asking you, which is this. I'd like to know for my own sake, but I think some other people here might like to know too. When you think about the state oil company in Mexico in terms of the government, how central to the budget is it, and how central is it to the running of the state? So that when you talk about a transition away from a state-owned monopoly, what would replace Pemex as the kind of cornerstone of the government?
Thank you very much. First, let me just, I'll go to the three questions that have been posed. First of all, about the level of prices. Practically through all of my career, because I had started in sort of international trade activities, the Ministry of Finance in Mexico would always ask me for a price forecast. And the more volatile the market became, they asked for more frequent price forecasts. And I always knew, as you know, Professor Chu has mentioned, that it was, for practical purposes, impossible to give any serious forecast. And I'm sure that I was wrong in every single one of the forecasts I gave the Ministry of Finance. When they really got very nervous, what I would do is I had learned this trick from Exxon. What I would do is tell them, look, instead of giving you a price, I'm going to give you a rule. And what you should do, and especially when you get very nervous, and many times during the day, all you have to do is take the average of the last year, prices of the last year, and then extrapolate them for 1 year. I knew that it would be wrong in any case, but it wouldn't be worse than what I was providing. So, very difficult. But I think here, looking at it in a more abstract way, I think that we are facing a situation in which the floor of oil prices, and by this I mean a sort of longer-term floor, not specific, day-to-day changes. It is that floor, I think, is really set by the marginal source of crude oil, and today that marginal source of crude oil are Canadian oil sands and deep water, ultra-deep water crude in various parts of the world. And, for these projects to be successful, it is impossible to believe that they can be done at less than $70, $80. So that is setting a floor to the price of crude oil. Probably it's also setting a ceiling in the sense that if you go much above that, a lot of supply will come forward. So in a sense, these marginal sources are the ones that will be setting the price, and not so much the financial requirements of the Saudi royal house, or of Saudi Arabia more generally, or any of the Emirates for that reason. So, I think we're in for a longer period of relatively high prices, looking sort of longer term. Now, I'm convinced, and I mean, you didn't mention, my only claim to fame is that I spent practically all of my life working for Pemex. And at the end of my time there, I was the CEO. But what is it that I think for the Mexican energy reform to be successful, I am convinced that it necessarily implies really bringing about fundamental change within Pemex. Of course, you could just say, well, let's dismantle this dinosaur and just break it up in pieces and have a garage sale. But that is not something that is really in the cards. So if you're going to be successful on energy reform in Mexico, you have to reform Pemex. And I think that the only thing that will move that are two events. One is to introduce competition. What has always been lacking is competition. And we have to introduce competition so that Pemex can improve. That's one. And the other, the government has to eventually really put a much harder budget constraint on Pemex. And in those businesses that are losing a lot of money, well, eventually, if you cannot make them make money, you have to close them down. So you have to have that. And that's our only possibility. And that's why the challenge is really very great. Now, it's also very great at the macroeconomic level, because currently the government gets from Pemex and from the Mexican oil industry a bit more than 30%, 33% on average for the last 4 or 5 years, over the last cycle, let's say, of its revenues. And for the reform to go forward, clearly you have to reduce the tax rates, the effective tax rates that you have on Pemex, and of course that you would have with private industry. And so, that transition is going to be really tough in the sense of, on the one hand, reducing, as our central, the president of our central bank said before, we have to depetrolize the public finances of Mexico. It's not going to be easy. And you know, people sort of balk about how fast they can do that. So they have to, if you really want to do it, you have to raise other tax revenues to be able to allow for a lower government take in the oil industry to make it prosper.
I'm going to turn it over to everybody, so I hope you're thinking about questions. Let me ask one really brief question of each one of these guys. Steve, what do you think the chances are for government cooperation on energy and the environment in North America, and what do you think the opportunities are for government cooperation beyond North America in terms of the kinds of thing that Jim's talking about, where we can really come together and put in something that bites?
Well, before I answer that, you should ask me what do I think the chances are of government cooperation within the United States.
Touche.
Because until we get that one solved, we can only do things on the margin. There are going to be some things that are of mutual interest. There is a bit of a tension between this question of the Trans-Canadian pipeline. There are pipelines coming in from Canada right now. The major pipelines bringing oil from the Dakotas, for example, are being reversed. They're being built up. There are being things like that. The trains are gearing up if there's no pipeline to just go over the border on a train. So these things are happening, but then Mexico's concerned about how are they going to develop a market in Asia, given the fine amount of time it takes to do that transfer, having to do with the refineries, their customers, things of that nature. So there's a concern in the midterm there in Mexico. Jim and I are going to go to Calgary, next week?
Next week. Thursday.
And I'll probably say something about environment and climate change. And so here's one time I do wish I had my former security with me. but they promised to be civil. And but seriously speaking, I think there are all of these issues at work. And I will say what Jim said, and I would repeat what I said, Adrian said, to benefit and to get a plan to help us make these transitions collectively, the three countries, would be very beneficial economically for economic reasons, for energy security reasons, for many, many reasons, and ultimately for the environmental reasons.
Okay. Jim, I know that when I was going through your biography, I was moving very quickly, so I'm not sure if everyone heard all the different jobs you've had. But one of them had to do with Indian affairs.
Right.
What role do Indians in Canada play in terms of, it seems they have a special role in terms of resource development or just in terms of what happens, especially in the West?
Good question. I was, in fact, for a period of time, Canada's Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, but behind that, I had spent many of my years as a land claim negotiator working with Canada's First Nations, and so I have some sensitivity to that. The dynamic we're talking about of North American energy security means that Canada, and I think also Mexico and even the United States, need to be externally focused in terms of the Asia-Pacific basin. Because if you look at the supply-demand balance, the future demand for energy, for hydrocarbons, is not in the United States, it's not in Canada, it's not in Europe, it's in the Asia-Pacific basin, specifically in non-OECD countries. I say all of that because Canada, from the perspective of our country, can only orient itself towards the Asia-Pacific basin if we deal with Canada's First Nations, because they have preeminent legal and constitutional positions that have a unique source in Canadian history. And in the case of British Columbia, those claims have never been settled. The result is that while Canada has two major pipeline proposals for the West Coast and is debating 12 different LNG projects, of which there's probably only market room for 3, none of those projects can really proceed without some sort of an arrangement that brings First Nations in as a fulsome economic partner. And I think people have come to realize that. It was probably realized late in the game, both by Canadian governments and industry. But I think it's become quite clear to people that First Nations will have to be full economic partners in these kinds of projects. And those negotiations are, I think, now advancing.
Okay. Adrian, let me ask you a question which, for some of the people in the room, at least certainly in California, the population that is most sensitive about energy and the environment is Latinos. And that's the way the polling has worked for years, and that's the way the voting has worked for years. So let me ask you that in terms of popular attitudes towards energy and the environment, is that something that is also true in Mexico, or is that something that's true of Mexican Americans but not of Mexicans?
I must say, I'm very surprised what you're telling me. I had no idea that Latinos were more sensitive.
By about 20%.
Environmental issues here than, let's say, the rest of the population. In the case of Mexico, I suspect that, you know, the issue of, there's two different issues. One is the really longer term global warming set of issues. And the other has to do more with local pollution. In a sense, since, you know, the discussion and debate in other countries has tended to global warming, because they have solved many of the issues involved in local pollution, we have sort of joined into that debate, but we have not yet fully solved some really very basic concerns regarding local pollution. So I think we should balance better the concerns of the population and help them and help educate public opinion to the issues of local pollution and not only to global warming. Now, having said that, clearly the issue of global warming is something that by many people is perceived to be so far away that I suspect that's the reason why young people are much more interested in it than older people, because simply their life scale is a different one. So in that respect, you know, one can understand why younger people, and this is also the case in Mexico, are much more interested in environmental issues than the older generations. But I'm really surprised by what you mentioned. But allow me just to make a couple of comments on what has been said. And that is the direction of trade in hydrocarbon has already changed dramatically. I mean, the Atlantic Basin, who used to be the locus of oil markets, has been totally displaced to the Pacific Basin. And in that process where, you know, the constraints and the disruptions that are taking place are not small. But that's already taken place and is well advanced. It is going to go much further, and that's why Canada has to look to the west, probably much more than to the east. I understand why it has to look to the south. Now, in the case of the flows from Canada, and that poses a problem for the NAFTA group, of the flows of Canada through the Keystone Pipeline into the US, it really displaces in a big way and in a discontinuous way, the moment that pipeline is in place, the movement of heavy crude oil from Mexico to the US. Up till now, we've been displaced out of the light and extra light crudes. But the moment that pipeline is on stream, and I think there's a very compelling case, economic case for that pipeline. So I suspect it will be built. But even if it's, and that will displace our heavy crude exports, no doubt about it, because Canada, for at least a period of time, will have no choice. And the only way to move their crude will be directly into the Gulf Coast. So that is going to affect us, I think, very in an important way. Now, If the pipeline is not authorized for some reason, it will only delay a couple of years the effect of heavy Canadian crude on the U.S. Gulf Coast market. So, we have to prepare for it. And it has to do with this more general overall change in the direction of trade that is taking place in the world. Direction of trade in hydrocarbons.
Okay. We are now ready for questions.
We've been talking for.
Hang on.
We've been talking for over an hour about energy, that the word atomic energy has not been uttered. And so I think I'll look at Professor Chu and hope anyone will pipe in who'd like to. What do you believe the role will be in providing carbon-free emissions, the role of atomic energy in our future and that of our neighbors?
I'm hoping the United States will continue using nuclear energy at least for the next half century. Quite candidly, it's about 20% of our electricity generation. It is carbon-free, and so it's a way to, help us wean ourselves from carbon emission-based energy. But on the flip side of that, this is keeping the current nuclear reactors. They're going to be within the next 10 or 15 years, nearing the end of their 40-year lifetime. What fraction of them will be extended to 60 years? There's another issue about the new nuclear reactors. And that's a different issue because it's a huge capital investment. And that's the thing that's giving pause. Can you build them on time, on budget? And even if you can build them on time, on budget, you're looking at natural gas. And quite candidly, renewables are going to be cheaper. Renewables are chasing natural gas very rapidly, wind especially. So I think the huge capital investment and a 2 or 3 year delay in a construction project, it could be financially disastrous, especially when most of the utility companies are betting a fair fraction of their net worth on a new $8 billion per gigawatt reactor. So there are issues there. We turn to the others on their view of nuclear in Canada and Mexico, but to not use the asset, if we can, and safely, to not use that asset is something that would be a shame in my mind. Just as Germany is turning off prematurely, I think that's fundamentally a shame. I love renewables. And again, by mid-century, we better decrease the carbon emissions drastically. But I see it as nuclear power, at least to help us over that, as part of that.
So there's a major cost issue per kilowatt of the capital cost.
Correct. Correct.
In case of
Yes. In case of nuclear, in case actually of a new coal plant, even without with just the traditional scrubbers, even forgetting carbon capture technology, a new coal plant, a 40, 41, 42% thermal efficiency coal plant, those things are very costly. Wind is cheaper than that.
In the case of Canada, as I recall, about 13% of our electricity is generated by nuclear. We have a very clean electricity system. Over 60% emits no carbon whatsoever because it's either renewables, hydro, or nuclear. There have been several large nuclear refurbishments in the last number of years. The challenge right now, which Dr. Chu speaks to, is that as we look at refurbishing some of the existing nuclear plants, they're competing against this very low natural gas base. And it's the same issue for hydro as you consider a hydro project in Canada. The competition is very low natural gas. For how long, one would need to project.
Part of the energy reform that the government is proposing in Mexico really is directed to the electricity sector. And they're part of the challenge is how to make, again, a state monopoly was an important obstacle to bring in renewable energy. So how can you, once we sort of do certain we develop new arrangements for the electricity sector in Mexico, how it can take greater advantage of the renewable sources. And there are very significant ones. In the south of Mexico, without any doubt, I mean, the wind power that can be captured there is enormous because of very specific conditions in the area. But it's in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. And in the north of the country, solar, I think, has a great potential. So it's a question of how you set up the institutional arrangements to be able to make a greater use of these sources. But I think they have to play a greater role without any doubt. But at the same time, I must say that I think hydrocarbons will continue to be the central source of energy over the next 20, 25 years, in the case of Mexico.
Jim?
Yeah, I wanted to key off on your comment about the national cooperation, prospects for national cooperation in the context of NAFTA. And David Kennedy started off the previous session by bringing to our attention the treaty between BC, Washington, Oregon, and California. And by adding Mexico, you have the fourth largest economy globally. My question is what are the prospects for a subnational a collaboration between the countries in the context of Canada? And I know, Tom, you're a particular fan of California's climate policy around carbon markets. And I'm wondering if there's a market-based mechanism to provide that, if you will, those additional incentives, take advantage of a surplus situation with fossil fuels and kind of ride on that wave and provide some sort of a transitional program based on a carbon market model that might accelerate the transition to renewables in a way that's beneficial to the economy.
Let me begin. I'm all in favor of that. I think long before we get national policies, is things like that. Well, just as Ottawa is talking to on the East Coast, bringing hydroelectric power in to PJM, okay, and transmission lines, because the opportunity to link the hydro resources with the solar and the wind resources. And hydro, let's not forget, hydro turns on even quicker than the fastest new natural gas turbines. Within a matter of a minute, you get going. Now, it's not, you don't have to do that anymore. You push a button. And again, it's a natural to begin to be a natural buffer for the renewables and the transient nature of renewables. So, and then eventually, I'd love to begin to start seeing hydro as a storage mechanism, punch hydro as a storage mechanism. There are several areas, and the Columbia River is for a start, but other areas where you can begin to, if we're closely spaced dams, you can do this. So I think that is actually could be a very natural sort of thing that regionally you begin to cooperate because it's good business, it's good environmental stuff, and there's a will, at least from British Columbia to Washington to Oregon to California and hopefully Mexico. There's certainly a will to get going. Right now, it's a memorandum of understanding, is my understanding. It doesn't have any teeth, but
Outside of the hydro focus, specifically with regard to carbon markets as a mechanism for doing that, I'd like your thoughts on that.
Well, just to step in, let me deal with the other point. First, I'm very supportive of regional cooperation. I think there's common interests amongst us as Western North Americans that belie that. I do hope in the context of doing that, we don't lose sight of the bigger picture. I think there sometimes are unintended consequences we need to be careful about, and I would use two illustrations. One are basically low carbon fuel standards. The other are renewable portfolio standards. So in some jurisdictions, subnational standards, renewable portfolio standards have been brought in, and unintended consequences that they discriminate against Canadian hydro. Perhaps not intentionally, but that's the effect of it. And so in that sense, we lose sight of the bigger picture of what we're trying to do as North Americans operating under NAFTA. And also low carbon fuel standards. If we have a proliferation of different low carbon fuel standards at a subnational level, I think it behooves us to actually have a discussion between the national governments about what we're trying to achieve. And if what we're trying to achieve is a standard for
carbon-emitting fuels, then we should have one, but we should negotiate it on a national basis. And it should apply to every barrel of oil that is produced on the continent or exported, imported into the continent. It should not be selective. It should be something that we sit down and we negotiate and we agree upon. And I think we're at danger of losing that commonality under NAFTA, which has produced the world's most efficient markets, and we should try to keep them that way.
Let me just take, David, do you have a comment? David Kennedy, did you have a comment?
Well, it won't surprise you, this is a question with a regional focus. Another term that hasn't really been heard very much is grid. And as everybody up there knows, there are 3 grids in the United States. There's an eastern grid, a western grid, and a Texas grid. I honestly don't know what the situations look like in Mexico and Canada. I don't know what degree of interdigitation there is, if any, between the various US grids and the transnational Mexican and Canadian. But so that's the background. The question is simply, are there opportunities for greater regional coordination efficiency in the construction and management of those grids, including better international cooperation?
Let me begin. I think, yes, crudely speaking, there are those 3, but actually, if you look at the Western Connect, the Eastern Connect, ERCOT is a unified thing. They actually are a unified thing. But if you look at the Western interconnects, they're not as unified as you think. Just if you look at, for example, the San Diego blackout, the local distribution companies were calling each other on the phone. What's going on in your area? We don't seem to have lights. The local distribution and even the ISOs, there's a couple ISOs, the transmission, they believe strongly, foolishly I would add, that this is all proprietary information that's really important financially. And they lost sight of the fact that if they actually let each other know even the phase information that makes a more stable grid, there's actually much more money to be made. You can use your assets much more wisely. And so there again, that was one of my frustrations as Secretary of Energy, to try to convince the distribution areas and as well as the utility companies that if you all play cooperatively, you can do a much better job. And you can use your assets more wisely. And then it said, and they would all agree in principle, yes, you're right, but if that company makes more money than me, even though I'm making more money, I don't want to do it.
Is this more of an issue in the Western grid than elsewhere?
The Western grid has another issue. The Western grid is more of an issue also because of, the history of what happened in California, for example, and the price spiking and the market manipulation. And even actually doing energy balance and energy balance markets, the Western states are very suspicious of energy markets. Now the Eastern states have come along and they're getting used to that. But it's not clearly an open market. PJM, in a certain sense, is a cartel, and they guard their borders very, very closely, and as to whether they will allow energy flows from, let's say, the southeast of the United States, where the energy is cheaper, and also from Canada, where energy is cheaper. And so there are a lot of businesses who actually like some of this fluctuation.
This actually is one of the most fertile grounds, I think, for North American cooperation. Again, I can't speak for the Mexican side of the border, but Canada does not actually have a national electricity grid because it doesn't transcend across the northern shield, which is sparsely populated. Instead, we have a series of regional grids, one in Atlantic Canada that ties into the northeastern seaboard, one in central Canada that ties into the Ohio Valley, and then the ones in western Canada that tie in. So they're essentially networks that service Canada but have tie-ins or the potential of tie-ins to the American network. And one of our greatest opportunities, and Dr. Chu and I spoke about this when we were counterparts, is to take advantage of that Canadian hydro potential and on those grid axes and bring it on stream.
In the case of Mexico, we have really not taken full advantage of the possibility of trading electricity across the border. There is a small amount, but it's a ridiculously small amount. And I suspect that as some of the institutional restrictions are relaxed, we will see a greater flow of electricity in both directions in the southeast of the US and the northern border of Mexico. So that's going, I think that's eventually going to happen. Now, I argued that on the trade side of hydrocarbons, things were moving and the market is taking care of it. What is important to note is that in Mexico, a very important industrial area around the Monterrey is really very close to South Texas. I mean, it's practically across the street. It's 200 kilometers from downtown Monterrey to the US border, probably even less than that. What I think will be new is investment, the type of investment flows that could take place both from all the way from Calgary and from, let's say, Texas, the south of Texas, the west of Texas, in the development of the non-conventional resources in northern Mexico. We've drilled very little. There's a lot of information that was acquired in the past on wells that were directed not to the Eagle Ford shale, but deeper deposits that tell us that there is a very significant potential for both natural gas and, to a smaller extent, crude, tight sand crude in the north of Mexico. But the cooperation on that, and I think will evolve if once we really get these energy reform in Mexico going.
Can I just, the connections across the borders, I'm thinking more now of Canada than Mexico. If I look in the east, there are really natural connections and energy should be flowing north-south. If I look in the Midwest, the wind resources, if you include Canada and Dakotas and down to Kansas, are enormous. And if you look at the wind studies, if you begin to unify that whole area, there's going to be pretty steady, the transient part starts to fade. And then you look on the western part, and that whole corridor there. So there are very natural north-south connections that we have not fully taken advantage of. Or we've even just scratched the surface, really.
Nancy?
A historic day for the solar industry in that it's the first securitization of solar assets took place at a rate much better than people had thought, 4.8%. And so this has a dramatic impact on the cost per watt of solar. At the same time, you have crowdfunding of solar assets picking up steam and democratizing access to investing in renewables. So I'm just, and the net effect of this is both to answer a citizen and consumer demand for more renewables, but also to drive down significantly the costs of renewable energy. So I'm just wondering what you think the role of these financial approaches is, and how will that reshape the game going forward?
Well, I think this is directed at me. I think it's great. I think with renewables, the cost of money is everything. The cost of fuel is kind of free. So it's the cost of capital. And the better you can lower the capital costs, the more advantage, gas has an advantage because it's a known quantity. You can borrow money to build a gas plant, and it's a known quantity. Okay, nuclear has a disadvantage because the on-time, on-delivery is an unknown quantity for 20 or 30 years, or maybe it's known in a not so good way. So the more you can democratize the sources of money, and the securitization was great. And I want more of that. I think we should allow investment opportunities that are allowed only in fossil, like mastered limited partnerships. That is to say that people in this room as individual investors can buy into Kinder Morgan, which is a pipeline, or they can buy into an oil exploration, or they can buy into a coal development, or they can buy into gas development. You cannot have that large community, which makes the capital cheaper, buy into a renewable energy development like wind or solar at a utility scale. Okay? And now if you could give renewable energies the same tax advantage of the fossil companies, that would drive down the costs. And then the relative balance of the relative cost, the levelized cost of electricity will shift out of the utility scale. So I love the securitization. I still want the utility companies to be part of the action, because they too can borrow money at very low rates. And they get increasingly nervous that as solar gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and then batteries within a half dozen years is going to be very inexpensive. You can have 10 kilowatt hours of batteries for a few $2,000, including electronics. And so the utility companies are afraid that the most valued customers, namely the ones who pay the bill, will go mostly offline. They can generate and store themselves. They can shift from noontime to, okay? And so they're getting scared, and their reaction, in part, of a fair fraction, was, we'll fight it politically. We're going to ask for hookup charges and de-hookup charges and monthly charges, if in case you have solar. And then they have yet to face the batteries. But they can borrow money very inexpensively, even lower cost than the securitization. If they partner with the First Solars and the Sun Cities and all these other companies, let the little companies, the emerging companies, be the light, nimble people who figure out all the technologies to make the installation cheaper, all the soft costs cheaper, the modules, the batteries, technologies going forward enough. Then they're part of a growth industry, and instead of a shrinking industry. And so their asset is they can borrow money cheaply. Okay, but if you don't get them on board and they don't see the wisdom in that, I could just see more political hurdles to say, oh, you want solar on your roof, it'll cost you, $100 a month to be able to tie into my system, or maybe even higher. So this is one of the issues that, because energy has such a heavy regulatory hand in these things, that it isn't going to be the internet free market that's going to govern. It's going to have to be, we're going to have to think this one through.
I can't comment on, solar is a tougher proposition in Canada because we're a country of 10 months of winter and 2 months of bad skating.
Yes, sir.
Someone mentioned that there was no discussion about nuclear, but another absent question is about water. As we go through this climate change, there are going to be significant droughts, particularly in the western hemisphere of North America. I'd be interested in your perspective on the relationship between energy availability and water.
Energy availability, water, sustainable energy, water, agriculture are so intimately linked now. California spends about 23% of its energy moving water. Of its electricity, I'll be precise, moving water. With inexpensive, abundant energy, clean energy, we have all the water we need. It's called the ocean. But it needs to be clean energy, right? Because in many areas around the world, desalination is becoming the major source of water. So, and in the whole Midwest, the wells are getting, have to go deeper and deeper. This has been going on for decades. We're beginning to mine for water the way we mine for oil and gas. Our use of water is completely unsustainable the way we're using it today, in the world and in the United States in particular. So this is a huge issue, but it's so intimately connected with energy. It's almost non-separable in a certain sense. Well, the climate might do that for us. I think first you have to change the way we use water in agriculture to a much more efficient way. There are certain areas within the United States where we shouldn't be doing water-intensive crops. Let's assume there's no drastic change in the next couple decades. These are things that I think in general one has to really discuss with the citizens of our country because it is becoming, even before I became secretary, when I was at Stanford even, I was saying that the thing that's going to hit climate change the hardest first will be its change of its impact on our water supply. And I still believe that.
Jim or Adrian, if you want to Tom?
This is a question for Professor Chu, not Secretary Chu. And now that you're no longer constrained by the politics or policies of the current administration, I'd be interested in your reaction and response to the case that your colleagues made for construction and implementation of the XL pipeline.
Well, I'm not completely unconstrained in that. Well, okay. Let me just say I'm not going to. Let me just say that you can. There are pros and cons both ways on that. In the sense that I see energy security in North America as a nice thing. It's better to buy your oil from Canada than from some other places, and to have North America be trading energy, there is an energy security issue. I am concerned about the environmental issues, but let's not leave it just on tar sands oil. There are hydraulic fracturing issues. There are all sorts of issues. The ability now, I'm for development of natural gas in the United States, but I'm also know that we've made some mistakes. And we have to improve both the regulatory nature of it and also try to get the companies that are developing this to, many companies are acting as responsibly as they can, and there's a few that one is very afraid of. And so how, to have the industry pressure itself, otherwise the old saying is you get the regulations you deserve. And it's the bottom feeders which may spoil it for many other people. Now, in the tar sands issue, there are issues, both on the above ground and as you go below. Below ground, it's going to be cleaner. It's going to be more energy intensive. The carbon balance of this, which is, I think, partly what Jim was talking about, but also, you have to also compare it to the very heavy crudes that we get from other countries. And so you just have to say, now, having some of that pressure there is not all that bad because it stimulates the industry to develop these resources in a cleaner way. And it's a false choice to say it's either or. Either you do tar sands and play, just accept the consequences because it's jobs, it's industry, it's economic good for North America. It's not. You want to do both. And
security challenges any more rigorous than what we face in practice?
they're different. They're very different. And so I think just as in both the above ground and below ground, the tar sands and the hydraulic fracking, where there have been some mistakes, it's don't believe everything you see in Gasland for sure, but also don't believe that there have been no mistakes and accidents and corners cut. And so you just have to say, okay, you've got to do this in an environmentally responsible way. Don't kill the goose that lays the golden egg. And the one thing I'm hoping the oil and gas companies take away from this is that if you do pollute a major water table, it could be game over in a lot of states. And so you just do not want to do that. And because I would love to see natural gas, because I do believe it's a transition fuel. As we develop renewables and energy storage and sane transmission distribution cooperation. But I would say, the president has stated that he's going to look at, the full environmental stuff. He's not going to make a snap decision, and so actually for that, I'd say, yeah. It's ultimately, I'm not the president. I don't get paid the big bucks.
Let me say this, we have, by my clock, slightly over 3 minutes left. And I know that there are a lot of people with questions here, but before I go to one last question, let me just ask each of the panelists if there's anything they want to get in before it hits 5:30 and you guys rush to the bar.
Well, just to follow up on the last question, I won't reiterate the argument I made in favor of the Keystone XL pipeline, other than to say this. If the issue is the Canadian oil sands and the production of oil from the oil sands, then our two countries should discuss that and should arrive at common standards that apply to everyone on both sides of the border. The solution is not to impose on Canadian industry a competitive burden that's not acceptable in the United States or in Venezuela or any of the other countries that produce hydrocarbons.
Okay, Adrian, is there anything you'd like to?
I think that fracking is here, and it will be here with us, and we really have to make a special effort to reduce the impact of the fracking. And I'm not really thinking about fracking, but things like well integrity, which is clearly very important. And the other issue that I'm really concerned about is the fugitive emissions that all of this involves. So we really all have to make a much greater effort and be much more sensitive to the environmental impact. And not only of what happens in the subsurface, but really on the surface. The intensity of services, the footprint on the surface of fracking is a very important one.
So I would like to say thank you to these three gentlemen. I'm not sure everyone knew when we started exactly how smart and knowledgeable these three guys are, but this has been an incredible opportunity for me to listen to you guys, and I think it's been an incredible opportunity for everyone in the room, so thank you.